So welcome everybody. We, as I mentioned, for those of you who were on with us earlier, we're really welcoming people from all across the country and from Canada to this safe and risk-free program. So welcome. No masks required, but when we walk out of here, everybody needs to wear a mask. Let me just... I just want to let you know that the organization that's hosting the event right now, this evening, is the GenAfter. We're a Washington-based 41-year-old organization that includes survivors, second and third generation members. And you can visit us at genafterdc.com to learn more about us and to become members and to see what our other programs are all about. We are going to be recording this, and so please keep your mute buttons on, and we will be posting the recording and sending it out to everybody in a short while. Our moderator, Aviva Kempner, will begin the program with a number of questions that she's going to ask our speakers, Deena, Dlusy-Apel, and Max Beer, for the first part of the hour, and then we'll be opening it up to your questions. And the questions will be taken from the chat. So you can write right in the bottom, in the middle of your screens. I think that's true for most everyone. Not sure about those on iPads and phones, but hit the chat and let us know your question, and we will try to get to as many of them as we possibly can. So I'm delighted to welcome everybody to this terrific program and to welcome our speakers, Deena, Dlusy-Apel, and Max Beer, who came to filmmaking after years as educators and activists in a range of arenas. They have a really eclectic, fascinating background. Deena taught English and art in high school, and after getting a master's, taught art at Concordia University. Max taught math in high school and then received a master's degree in both history and political science. They are activists who've addressed issues such as racism, breast cancer, and the Holocaust. And for the past 10 years, they have been collaborating on film documentaries, with their first film called Nobody Was Interested, Nobody Asked, focused on the post-war treatment of Jewish refugees in Montreal. Will the Second Generation Please Rise continues the story of how the children of survivors have been impacted by their parents' experiences and what their work has been to keep alive the lessons in memory of the Holocaust. Aviva Kempner is the daughter of a Holocaust survivor and a rescuer, and a DC-based filmmaker who has made award-winning documentaries about underknown Jewish heroes for over 40 years. She is currently working on a documentary on the insidious use of Native American mascoting in sports, a biopic on the screenwriter Ben Hecht, who worked closely with the Bergen-Belsen group to save European Jewry from Nazis and allowed them to come to America. Aviva just received a grant from the Claims Conference to digitize all the interviews she took of those in the Jewish resistance for her film Partisans of Vilna, which will be on a new DVD and deposited in all Holocaust archives. So with that, I am delighted to turn the program over to Aviva Kempner and Deena and Max.
Myself, right. Well, first of all, kudos to you, Anat, and the organizers for continuing to doing great programming. So I know for my sake, I really appreciate it, and I'm sure everyone who joins us tonight. I didn't think I could cry anymore after crying all afternoon with Congressman Lewis's funeral, but I have to say I went back to the film before tonight, our program tonight, and kudos to Max and Deena for really doing a really moving and revealing and something I really identify with, oral history film. So I really appreciate that you've done that. Can you give us a little bit more background on your, what we call 2G connection? I mean, were you all born in Europe? What kind of upbringing did you have in terms of identifying being children of Holocaust survivors? and how you wound up in Canada.
It,
Did you heard my question?
You're muted.
They're on mute.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear us
You
now?
muted us.
Yeah.
Hi. Good evening, everyone. Sorry about that. Start.
I'll start. I was born in Pocking, a DP camp in Bavaria, 1947. My parents are originally from Poland. They got to Germany after the war because of what was going on in Poland after the war. They were still killing Jews there, and so they fled, I think, through Czechoslovakia and into Germany. And that's where I was born. And then how did we get to Canada is interesting because my father's father had come to Montreal in, I think, the late 20s, early 30s. I'm not sure exactly when. He left the family, and I don't know the whole history, what happened, but he left the family. So, so he sponsored us, and that's why we came to Canada. And Deena has another kind of story because she was born here in Montreal.
My father came before the war. He left many members of his family behind. All we ever heard from him was that certain family members, his sisters, couldn't come into the country because they had a speech impediment or they were bow-legged, but we didn't hear much more than that. I went to a private Jewish school, and all my teachers were survivors. One of them was very, very influential in a survivor group. I think that was worldwide, Paul Trepman. And we heard, they would stand in front of the class and tell us stories about how their families were, murdered in front of them very often. But until I met Max, this wasn't a focus for me. I was always the Jewish person in a situation when we taught in a school where there were very few Jews. People would come and ask me questions about Judaism, but the Holocaust, until I met my mother-in-law, it's a very, very interesting story because when I met my mother-in-law, I was a secret. Max didn't introduce me to his mother. I was a big, big secret because she was very suspicious about any of his friends. And he went fishing one weekend and I phoned her up and I said I was going to come and meet her. And I walked in and she said, "Hi, Dinah." I said, "My name is Deena." And she continued to call me Dinah for the rest of her life. And she told me that she had had another child and another husband before the war, and that Max didn't know about this. And I said it would be our secret. And of course, I couldn't wait for Max to come home. He walked through the door and I said, "Did you know your mother had another child and another?"
I had no idea.
He had never known this.
No.
And his mother and I became very, very close. Her brothers and sisters became real to me. They just became part of my extended reality.
Interesting. Max, how old were you when you came here? Came to Canada?
2 years old. I was about 2. I was
Right.
born in 47. I came in 49.
So I'm curious, did either of you grow up hearing other than English at home? Was it Yiddish, Polish?
Yiddish. I spoke Yiddish at home.
And so did I.
Yeah. So that was your first language?
That was my first language, yeah.
And did you live in communities where all with other Jews, almost like a shtetl, because it seems like Montreal
Oh, yeah.
was right.
Much
So
like that, yeah.
although the story you just told about your father's family or the grandfather that came and not people know about, lies, it reminds me of lies my father told me. One of the best, I was telling our filmmakers that there are 3 great films about the North American Jewish experience. Lies My Father Told Me, Judy Kravitz, both Canadian, and Hester Street, which of course is New York. So what made you sort of leave your education artist fields to make the first film, which title was No One Was Interested, No One Asked?
It was a long story in a way, because I went back to school and I started working in Montreal on a master's in history, and I was looking around for something to write a thesis on. And then I realized that nobody really had written about this topic. Nobody had really discussed this. And
It being the Montreal survivor community?
yeah, about the Montreal survivor community, and the fact that nothing was really talked about, both during the war and after the war. During the war as well, there was a lot of silence. I mean, everybody kind of knew what was happening, but nobody spoke up. And also in Montreal at that time, you might not be aware of it, there was a very, very right-wing government in Quebec.
Right.
And the leader was a guy called Maurice Duplessis, who was kind of like, I guess if you would compare him to, who was a Huey Long, like in Louisiana, kind of that kind of a figure. You know, very, very right-wing, also very religious, very Catholic.
All stores were closed in Quebec
On Sunday, yeah.
on Sunday. It was the artists who changed things in Montreal.
Yeah.
It was the artist community who sort of released us from the...
But there was a long period of time where, you know, nothing was talked about, and he basically ran the show.
And is that when a lot of Jewish families went to Toronto, or was that
No,
when
they went to
the
Toronto.
The French thing, that was later?
In 1976, there was an election, and the Parti Québécois won. It was a nationalist party, and they won. And then there was a big exodus to Toronto. I must say, though, it was not a right-wing party.
Right.
In fact, it was a left-wing party run by somebody called René Lévesque.
So when were you writing, what year were you writing the thesis, and then when did it morph into that first film?
Oh, I started writing the thesis in just around the year 2000 or so. Yeah.
At that point, I was teaching at Concordia, and they opened up an oral history department, a man called Stephen High, and there was a genocide component to the oral history department, and we both started interviewing survivors for Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, and that also. And then you started to work at the.
Yeah, then I became a docent at the Montreal Holocaust Museum, and so everything kind of came together at one time, and then after gradually we started making the movie.
I remember when Max was talking about his thesis to survivors, they started saying, "Oh boy, you should hear, we have stories to tell you." And that's how the first movie sort of came to happen. They had so much that they wanted to talk about how about their reception in Montreal when they first arrived.
Yeah.
And how it wasn't all that great.
No, it wasn't.
Well, you know, it's interesting because when I read just about it, I just remembered a line my mother always used to say. You know, when I arrived in Detroit, it was after being in Berlin and Munich. And actually, my father was not a rescuer. He was in the U.S. Army, and he had come to America earlier, and his mother was murdered. My mother said, no one asked me. It was like they were afraid to ask, or they weren't interested. And do you have any sort of theory about why people, you know, weren't interested in hearing or wouldn't ask?
You have to see our first movie.
Okay, and can you tell us, until we do, you want to give us just a little summary?
But also, I remember as a kid, I remember sitting at home, and my mother would invite survivors to come to the house, and they would sit around, and that's what they would talk about.
Right.
What had happened in Europe, you know. But I think the conversation stayed there. I don't think too many people in Montreal, like the people that come before, were interested in their stories. I always heard, there's certain stories that kind of, that I always heard. One of them was whenever they started talking about what it was like in Europe, they were met by people who told them, you think you had it rough?
Yeah.
We had coffee rations in Montreal.
Butter rations.
In Montreal during the war. You know, you don't know how rough it was.
No tires.
You know.
You know, it'd be interesting after when you open it, Aviva, to the
Right, to hear from
other people telling their stories.
Yeah.
I like that about
Yeah.
this.
But I think the same phenomena happen here, and actually my mishpachah in Israel talk about, both my aunts who were survivors talk about no one asked them, and the kids talk about that too.
Oh yeah, no,
So I think it was pretty universal. And I
That
also
was universal.
European 2G friends. But when do you think it switched that we as the children started asking questions or making the films? I mean, I can talk about my experience,
yeah.
but what year was it that sort of switched in your head?
Well, but
Eichmann. I think Eichmann trial really changed a lot of things, don't you?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's when it really opened up and the world
All of a
became
sudden,
aware.
people
That's the early.
people were shocked
Yeah.
when they heard those stories. You know, even though they should have known before. I mean,
But we should know lots of things. It's interesting because we hear from other survivor, other immigrant populations, very similar stories. Very similar stories. So even though we think this is unique, we hear this from Italian communities that when they arrive and there is an Italian community that's already established, they distance themselves from the newcomers. They don't want to look foolish. They feel cool. They know to wear their baseball caps backwards, you know. So they don't want to be associated with these immigrants who you know, they're green.
Now I think it's
They're green.
But you know, if you read Steven Spielberg's interviews in making Saving Private Ryan, I'm not talking about Schindler's List.
Yeah.
He said his father would never talk about the war. So I think it's also American soldiers too. I think in a way my dad complained about that too, although he was writing journalist articles, so he was able to send things back to his relatives. I think there's a lot of soldiers, you'll hear stories time and time again when they came back that either they didn't want to talk about it, they're so traumatized, or people just weren't asking them.
People were that. I mean,
Yeah.
no, who did talk? Ben Heck did talk.
Yeah,
You know.
she knows.
Yeah, no,
As you know, Ben Heck did talk.
That's right.
yeah, to the point of affecting his career.
Yeah.
Now, then there's the second phenomena, and that's the survivors themselves. If they talk, I think it happened two ways. Either they told stories all the times, and that really affects children, or they didn't talk at all, which seemed to be more in my home. I always tease that if my mother had told stories, I may not have gone to make films about it. Because, you know, anytime there's a Holocaust movie on TV, protect it from mother. She lived it, let's not watch it. And of course, I went off and watched it. So I'm just curious when, you know, like Holocaust was on TV, or when Diary of Anne Frank, I mean, growing up, or Pawnbroker, which I remember very well, especially when he didn't win the Academy Award. I cried in my dorm room. Well, you know, Kapaloo, late Lee Marvin and Kapaloo beat Rod Steiger, the Holocaust survivor. To this day, I have never gotten over that. And I love comedy. So do you remember if you read the books, or like The Wall or Exodus? You know, I always say Exodus is how I learned about Auschwitz. My family didn't talk about it. And that's where my grandparents and aunt died.
Yeah. I mean, those came out like in the 50s and 60s, but I think the real explosion came like in the 70s. I mean, all of a sudden there was more than just one movie and one book. All of a sudden it kind of exploded. And
well, I contend Roots came out first, which is about the Black experience. And they remember Holocaust 4 or 5 nights. And that's before we could VCR it. And, you know, I thought that was a really important phenomenon. Did you get Holocaust on TV in
you mean like the NBC or CBS production?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was on there 4 or 5 nights. It was, she was in it. What's her name? Belonged to you.
Meryl Streep.
Meryl Streep, yeah. Yeah.
As well as Sophie's Choice.
Yeah.
Okay, so what was the experience? What kind of reaction did you get from the first one? And then, of course, we're going to talk about the one tonight.
The first one, well, there were naysayers. You know, there were people who said, you're not telling the truth or you're not telling the whole story. It wasn't like that. I got that.
A lot of Jewish people were absolutely sure that they had done everything they could have done. But if you ask them what they had done, they really hadn't done anything, you know. And it's not nice to sort of hear that, you know, for 50 years later, that maybe you weren't there to help when these things were going on. But it's typical. We're not pointing a finger and saying you should have. We're showing what happened. This is what happened. We can't say somebody should have done more, although we certainly think they should have done more. But that's not what we're saying in the film.
I remember once I walked into, I think it was a senior resident to interview somebody, and I was with somebody else who was doing the filming, and somebody came over to me and she said, "What are you doing here? What are you doing with the cameras and everything?" And I said, "I'm here to interview a survivor." And she said, "Whoa, I remember how nasty we were to them." And she started going in and talking about it. I said, "Well, maybe I could talk to you about this later, and you know, maybe if you want to be interviewed or something like that." And she said, "Oh, no. I'm friends with them now.
Yeah.
Friends with them now. I'm friends with their children. No. But I mean, it wasn't good."
I remember when the immigrant children arrived in our classroom, and again, this is something, oh no, okay, I remember when they arrived because I'm older, and everyone was laughing at them, and they had a hard time, you know. This was, what year was it?
In the 50s.
Yeah, early 50s, yeah.
Well,
I remember that so
people
well.
make fun of me and my, you know, I came and I was speaking German, you know, my accent or whatever in Detroit. So I totally understand.
Did you see The Polish Wedding? It's a film that came out this year. Or
Not yet.
it shows the kids how they have trouble. Like,
So what motivated you to do these fine testimonies of the film we watched and prepared for tonight?
I'm sorry.
Why did you then go on to do the second film? What motivated you?
I'm going to just begin over here. I guess we started to see a dwindling population in the survivor community. And we used to go to the Yom HaShoah commemorations, and every year they would say, will the survivors please rise? Do you have this? And you must have the same thing. And then they would say, will the second generation please rise? And one of the survivors, Paul Herzog, who just passed away, made a very inspiring speech to the second generation community saying, it's up to you to continue this legacy. And when, you know, it just seemed so obvious that this is what we should do.
Great. And you did it.
We found a lot of willing people who were willing to talk about it. I'll tell you that. We had no problem getting people to interview. Yeah.
Right.
There were some that we interviewed, by the way. I remember Evelyn Freitag, whose parents never talked about it. They didn't even know much about what had happened, and her parents were both survivors. So there's all sides to this story. You know.
Why do you think you had so many artists in the film?
I don't know if we had so many artists, but
I mean, I had that as a theme.
Yeah.
I have a lot of friends who are artists, obviously, being an artist, and but I think it just happened. It was word of mouth, and it was a coincidence. And after we had filmed for about 3 groups of the children of survivors, I looked at Max and I said, wow, I mean, we can really concentrate on
the art.
Right.
On what they've done already.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're very lucky in the Washington area. We also have 2G artists, and there was recently a show last December of those artists, and actually my mother, who was an artist. So I think it is a phenomena, and each one has a different way of expressing the 2G experience. So I'm wondering what other places you've taken it, especially if you've shown it in Germany, and what is the reaction, and also in Israel?
In Germany.
Never in Germany.
We haven't showed it in Germany.
We have German friends, but we haven't shown it in Germany.
Okay, well,
I wonder, in fact, it's quite interesting because I was very uncomfortable putting in that part about Germany. And I asked Max to leave it out. And after it was shown the first time, I think, I said, put it back in. Put it back in. I want it back
There's
in.
a section where the children of survivors are talking about how they felt about the Germans.
in
and
Germany, right.
If you-
There's one guy who goes on business and the others.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, and he's in a train, and all of a sudden he gets these flashbacks. A Jew in the train in Germany.
And I'm sure we all remember, all of you who are watching now must remember how, if you've been to Germany, that feeling of putting your feet down in that country.
Yeah.
We have a visceral reaction to it. There's no question.
Earlier, during college, because I just wanted to see Dachau and just see where I was born. But I'll never forget when I opened Partisans of Vilna, the Berlin Film Festival, and I wanted to take a shower, and there was something on the top, and I thought, oy, oy, oy. But I have to say, my mother would never step foot in Germany again. But when you meet, especially German filmmakers who have devoted, like people like Michael Verhoeven or actors like Armin Mueller-Stahl, who've devoted their lives to sort of write what was happened, or even some of the programmers that are as in another way as guilt-ridden as we are as filmmakers, to do our films, it really changed the perspective a lot for me and some of my best friendships, because we just have that in common, and they're good people. So
Yeah.
For sure.
right. I think one thing you touched on, which I haven't seen, I've read a lot, and my best girlfriend is Dr. Eva Fogelman, who's written about the trauma of being a 2G, but this whole thing about holidays. I think that was one of the best parts in your film, because I remember when I was young, and I, quite frankly, before my mother got some therapy, Jewish holidays were so difficult for her, because I'm sure it was just bringing up the memories of, growing up. It took some while before the holidays became happy again. And of course you have less people, but I have my dad's family in Detroit. So I want to commend you on having that. And I just wondered, maybe there's other people in the audience that would talk about it. And then you now talked about to us in a pre-discussion that you might be doing a film on as we call it, the 3G, the third generation.
The third generation.
So are you working on that yet?
We've done a bit of exploratory work on it. We've talked to somebody from the third generation who's actually she actually works at the Montreal Holocaust Museum, and she seems willing to cooperate with us.
It would be a very different kind of focus. It would probably really look at anti-Semitism and, its way it's rearing its ugly facing today in the world, and Israel, and how some of these kids feel about Israel. It would be rather political, I guess.
But I think the third generation also oftentimes, like my mother would talk, in some ways it was easier for her to talk like my niece a story.
Yeah.
I mean, it had a paper to do, and she told my niece more than she ever told me. And my mother always said, I wanted to protect you. But let me just mention one story, and again, I wonder if others had this reaction, is my brother has 3 daughters, and he never knew how to tell them about why, mother's story or this or that. And then one day they talked about my uncle. They said, boy, Uncle David, my mother used to call him Dudunyu, must have been really bad when he was young, because look at that tattoo on his arm. My uncle survived Auschwitz. That was the end to finally tell the girls about Auschwitz. So I just wonder if, those kind of things came up, and, I'll never forget that story. I mean, I wasn't there for the discussion, but I heard, why it was. I encourage you to do that the 3G story, because I think that's an important phenomena. So how do we tell people to get the first film? Because I want to make sure, or even the second film, so that people can get it out, because I know other people had really strong positive reactions to.
So I'll send the link. Can I send it to you, Annette?
Yeah.
The link to the first film, and you can.
Yes,
pass it on?
send it to me and I'll pass it on.
Okay.
We also have Deena Hirsch, our VP of Generation After, waiting in the wings. We have a lot of questions from the audience. So just to let you know.
Yeah, I think I've had my questions. I just, again, muzzle tough on bringing up so many important issues for 2G, and I just hope we can help you get the film out more.
Thank you, Aviva.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Aviva. Okay, Deena.
Okay, the first question that hasn't already been answered says, good evening, it's from Adele Goldfinger, Black. My father was liberated from Buchenwald. He had a very good friend named Hershey Wanderer, Harry. And she says later on that he lost touch with him. And they tried to find him, his children. If anyone has any knowledge of what happened to him, to contact her. If you have an answer to that, write it in the chat and we'll connect you. Let's see now. From Susan Avjian. Did you find anyone whose survivor parent actually asked to return to Europe because of the way the Jewish community or a foster family treated them?
Who returned to Europe?
I'm not quite sure what the question is. Would you mind repeating that?
Happy to. Says, did you find anyone whose survivor parent actually asked to return to Europe because of the way the Jewish community or a foster family treated them?
Not really. We didn't find anyone who returned to Europe because of the way they were treated.
No.
We heard horrible stories about, how when they arrived here, people thought that they would be like Vera. They wouldn't know how to behave in a civilized society. They didn't think they'd know how to use bathrooms.
Yeah. Some of them came here, said they were shocked. They had come like from Paris, from Berlin, from Prague, all these cities. They came here, and as soon as they rented an apartment or something like that, the landlord would take them and show them how to flush a toilet, how to turn on lights. They thought they were like from another world where they didn't know any of it.
And my friend from Prague says, and she said, and I thought that these people here were so uncivilized.
Yeah.
In comparison to where we were coming from. But I don't know anyone who went back, no, because of how they were treated. I heard that some of the families that took in young adults treated them as if they were hired help. I did hear that several times.
Yeah. Harry Bergen told that story.
Yeah.
About how they had this brother and sister in the house who had come from Poland. Then they were orphans, and nobody talked to them. They just took their rent money, and that was it.
Yeah.
They didn't sit with them. They didn't discuss anything with them. I mean, it's not a good time for a lot of them.
Deena?
And I was just thinking about what Aviva said before, and about the grandparents very often talking to the grandchildren, leaving out their children talking to the grandchildren.
Yeah.
Maybe they had to distance themselves somewhat from what had happened to them. Grandchildren tend to be freer with their questions. The children, you children of survivors, felt that it was touchy, like they didn't want to upset their parents with the questions. They saw that sometime when they asked questions, the parents would become upset because of their loss. And so they learned not to ask questions because they didn't want to see their parents crying. But the grandchildren, it was different.
Yeah.
It was different with them.
I remember.
Okay, so there's another question. The 2G people that you interviewed were mainly born in Germany right after the war. I am 65, no, a bit younger. Did you interview people who were born in the US in the 50s to see if their experience with their parents were different, let's say, than people born in Europe?
In Montreal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, Susie, yeah.
Some,
There were a lot who were 50 years
Yeah,
old. There
yeah.
were,
yeah, some were, their parents came here, their parents were young when they came here, and they didn't give birth till probably they were like in the mid-50s or late 50s or even into the 60s.
Were their experiences different from the older group?
From them, because their parents were young when they lost their parents, we heard a lot that they had to be the parents, that their parents weren't capable of parenting.
They never learned it from their parents. They didn't have parents.
Yeah.
You know?
So that's what we heard from the younger ones.
Yeah.
Their experiences were different. They were young, they survived the war, they were stronger, you know, and they had their youth still. So their experiences weren't as difficult as the ones who had older parents. They weren't as difficult, but they, as I said before, weren't capable of parenting to the same degree because they were very young, taken away from their parents.
Yeah, Adam Atlas, his mother lost her family when she was 3 years old or something like that.
And she was in an orphanage.
And she was in an orphanage. So I mean, what did she know about parenting? And somebody else, the Van Franks, yeah, they were allowed to run through the streets without any kind of supervision or anything. They ran wild when they were young because the parents didn't know how to be parents.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
that goes for a lot of us, I guess. We learned with our kids.
We learn on the job. Yeah. It's a question from Frida Pascal. Pesach was particularly difficult for my mother when I was growing up. She always said there were too many people missing. After many years, she was able to handle the holidays. So is there anything else you can tell us about people's discussions about holidays and Shabbat?
They were sad. They were very sad occasions and very lonely. Some people talked about 5 people at the Seder table, you know, and...
We were 4.
You were 4?
We were 4. I was me, my mother, my father, and grandfather. That was it. That was every holiday. That's who was there. That was it. You know.
Just one other question. I am a survivor of a Holocaust survivor who settled in Montreal after the war along with his 3 brothers. He and one brother were cantors in the large conservative synagogues in Montreal for 50 plus years. This is Ronit Glazer. So I don't know if you know this story or these people. No. Okay. Another question. Have you been able to interview any second generation who were active in the resistance, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and then the Irgun and Stern in smuggling survivors into Palestine? Another dimension to your story, perhaps. Actually, he really meant interview any survivors.
I'm think not really. The only thing I can relate to in terms of that question,
survivors, sorry, who were in the resistance. Yeah.
We have a friend who's in the film. We met him, and his name is Harry Rashcott, and he's writing a screenplay, a play, and it's all about this survivors who were in the resistance, and that's my only knowledge of this actually. But it's a very interesting play.
And he also was born in Puckink.
And he was born in Puckink.
Oh, he was born in Puckink too. Okay, another question from Gerard Loeb. Has anyone conducted research on family members who were in Bergen-Belsen at the end of the war? Were you able to find any information through what organization? Unable to get any information from the Arlson archives?
Aaron's parents were in Bergen-Belsen. Yeah.
Well, answer.
Yeah, I have a good friend who was born in Bergen-Belsen, and his parents went through there.
But we don't know about finding people.
No.
We can certainly find out a little bit more about it, and again, let Annette know.
Yeah.
Right.
By the way, there's two pictures in the film. One of them shows like nurses taking care of little children in Belsen. That was given to me by my friend, whose
And
whose
there's
parents
another
were.
one.
And there's another one of carriages
Oh,
going
yeah.
through the streets of Bergen-Belsen after the war. That's also given to me by my friend.
Mhm.
They should check with Menachem Rosensaft because there was a very strong Bergen-Belsen association, and there's a lot written about it.
Someone,
Somebody has a phone.
Somebody is unmuted with a phone. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. It's
okay.
Okay.
All right. Another question. Zella Shavason says, I think it would be interesting to hear from hidden children during the Holocaust who either had to hide their Jewish identity or found out later on that they were Jewish.
Mhm.
And also their second generation children,
Right.
did you hear stories about parents who were hidden during the war?
Well, Adam's mother was hidden.
Yeah,
She was brought up in a nunnery. Yeah.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
did hear
Yeah.
some stories. I grew up with a girl whose mother was hidden and during the war. I've heard stories, but we didn't interview anybody.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Along with the holidays that were so difficult, Stanley Tischler asks or says, Yizkor was especially difficult for my parents who mentioned 33 names during the service.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Was that a theme at all, Yizkor?
No, it didn't come up. It
No.
didn't come up.
Did the aspect of Jewish religion come up for the survivors? What kind
Let's
of
do another movie, I think.
Yeah, another movie.
Another movie.
Yeah. That's a good aspect. I know.
No,
No.
it didn't come up. We really didn't give them the questions. We put them in the room together and we let it go wherever it went. We
asked very few questions.
didn't ask questions. We
Yeah.
really didn't.
Yeah.
We let people talk, and we have 16 hours. We were telling Aviva and Annette the other day, we have 16 hours, and my dream is to have PBS or someone just show all 16 hours, because every word that everybody said is worth hearing and worth listening to, and just have the sessions, because the sessions were just so excited. Nobody ever wanted to leave. They said, can we do this again? Can we do this again? And I don't know whether you realize we didn't get any help with making this movie, and
Very little.
very, very, very little. And everything we just did because we love doing it. And we didn't really have any more time to devote to it.
Amazing achievement. I just wanted, I think it was Gerard who asked about Bergen-Belsen. So we have a few people had said, Lisa says, my father was in Bergen-Belsen. Pauline Steinhorn, my mother and grandmother were liberated from Bergen-Belsen. I mean, I'm sure there is a Bergen-Belsen organization.
There was in Montreal. There was and there's a book I borrowed something called Belsen. That was put out sometime in the 50s, and it has a lot of pictures in there actually.
And we can send Annette the name of the book and everything. I'm going to write it down.
Yeah,
right. And Menachem Rosensaft were very active after liberation,
and they're very active. There's a whole group in New York. There's a lot written, So I think. If you just Google Menachem's name in Bergen-Belsen, he went every year to events.
Right.
I know there's a lot written about it, so I think they'll be okay finding it that way.
Susan Avigian, also, her mother was in Bergen-Belsen.
There's actually an annual event at Belsen.
Right, at Bergen-Belsen.
I've been to twice.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
So that was
I
Lisa.
don't think Aaron's parents
Um,
were back there.
He says,
Yeah.
someone,
Rita
someone
passed.
here says his father needed help in how to flush the toilet.
He grew up in Poland not having a toilet in their apartment.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
that's true. That's true.
That's true, for sure. And Auschwitz, he says, certainly didn't have flush toilets,
No.
that's for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. Miriam writes, by the way, an exceptional book about hidden children was written by her relative, Susan Vromen, and it's a great resource. Vromen, if anyone is interested. Ellen Greenberg says, my mother was hidden in a convent. I have her testimonial tapes. She passed away from COVID, May 11th. Happy
Wow.
to talk with you.
I'm sorry.
And Ronit Gisser says, my memories of holidays are all positive, actually. I think my experience is different because my father married late in life to a younger woman born after the war. So much time had passed between his trauma and raising a family.
There are so many different stories.
There's so many stories.
So there are so many stories, and there's, I hope I can save these this chat thing, because there's some amazing information in here. I'm just scrolling through to look for questions. Did you ever, Eva Kraus asked, did you interview anyone that grew up in Eastern Europe with survivor parents?
Oh, in Eastern Europe, her, what's her name? The one
That's David.
no,
Bronya.
Bronya Zaks, an artist. Her work is in She grew up, and after the war, they all lived in Poland, and they even had a Christmas tree in the house. They try to pass as Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, if you've been to the museum in Berlin, you saw that most of the Jewish people had Christmas trees in their house.
Yeah, they were really
rather assimilated and didn't help. There's a question here. There's somebody saying, oh my goodness, I lost it. Oh, right. Someone says they don't recall attending memorial services on Yom HaShoah as a child or young adult. And I only started going when I moved to Pittsburgh. And that's true. I remember these services in Jewish People's School where I went until I was 18 years old. Even Hebrew Teacher Seminary I went to. So I do remember these services, but only in the school. And it's true, we didn't have this when my kids were growing up and went to the same school. I don't remember these memorial services either. And somebody said that even when she remembers, Edie Cooper, who's in the film, I don't know if she says it in the film, she says she does remember going, but the services were in Yiddish. And the reason they were in Yiddish was that no Galer, you know what Galer are, the Jews who came before the war, ever attended these services. That the only people that attended these services were the Grina, were the immigrants, the survivors. Yeah, and nobody else was interested.
Yeah, she says like for 10 to 15 years after the war, they were all in Yiddish. Nobody even asked them why they were mourning or anything like that. You know?
It was messy. Nobody really wanted to deal with it.
Yeah, no, I think it's very true. And, you know, even though I don't know if everyone knows, but Yad Vashem was established in 1953. So quite early on, but still there wasn't this discussion in Israel either, really until the Eichmann trial.
Right. And one of the reasons they had the Eichmann trial was to show the new generation what had happened. Mm-hmm. You know.
And it worked.
And it worked. To bring it out.
Just Freddie Paquet is sharing that there's a new book published by one of the San Diego second generation members called From Bergen-Belsen to Brooklyn. So there seems to be a lot of work going on about Bergen-Belsen. Did any of your parents experience hunger after coming to the United States or Canada? My mother did, it says here. Yeah. They didn't talk about poverty or hunger?
There were, no, we didn't hear this.
No.
Let's see. In your documentary, Susan Avigian asks, you mentioned epigenetics, but artist interpretations are not really what epigenetics is about. Was there anyone who actually fell into this mode? Some of the first research about Holocaust survivors and the link with epigenetics was from researchers in Germany.
not only research. Do you want to talk about it?
Don't like the word.
If you want to talk about,
Sophia, one of the artists, talks about the fact that she
went to the country and she saw bullet holes on the wall somewhere. It was actually hunters were target practicing, and she
had a visceral response.
Yeah.
She feels that it is passed on from generation to
Yeah.
generation. What's her name?
Rachel Yehuda.
Rachel Yehuda talks about that. We read quite a lot of stuff on that. Our children do some work on that also. Psychologists and do some work on the epigenetic effect of trauma. The same situation applies to children who were born after 9/11, and they also are supposedly experience this epigenetic. It's a very interesting topic, but I mean, it's obviously very young and very unexplored and very difficult to prove.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you said that, because I work in the cancer field, and we know about epigenetics, and it's fairly new, and
Right.
And on the behavioral level, it's even difficult to understand the biophysiology and the molecular and cellular level. On the behavioral level, it's really difficult.
My therapist used to say, "You earned your anxiety honestly."
Yeah, but we don't know if that's environmental or if it's.
Well, I think, you know, I certainly think there are epigenetic effects. I'm a psychotherapist also, and or I was, and I have no doubt.
I think there's, unfortunately, there's really no solid evidence in terms of, the biological connection about epigenetics, which happens not genetically when you're being born. It's a somatic reaction after you're born. So there are changes in the RNA possibly after birth. Anyway, we'll get back to that. We're going to go back to the chat now, Miriam, and because people have written in lots of questions.
Can I just say one thing?
Yes.
That I think in America, I don't know if you had a whole movement to establish a museum, but these wonderful devoted survivors got together and they got the government to do the U.S. Holocaust Memorials Museum. And I think that really changed the whole depiction of how people viewed survivors and made a part, of the landscape. I live in Washington, D.C., and we have to give a lot of credit to like Ben Mead and Sam Block and Hadassah Rosenstaff and all these people. And of course, also the congressional people who supported it. I can't even remember who was president then. But once that happened, I think it totally changed. I think it really taught people a lot. And I can even remember going back to Detroit for a wedding with my mother, and the third generation treating my mother so differently because they were starting to get Holocaust education. And it was almost as if, oh, you're a survivor. And I said to mother after, I said, boy, were you ever treated like that years ago? She said, and it's good. I mean, the third generation was more sensitive. So, I mean, don't you feel that in terms of once the museum was established?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I have been completely impressed by the work going on with 3G DC and 3G New York and other groups as well. 3G groups, they're really doing amazing work. And I think the relationship between the grandparents and the grandchildren is something very special and very unique.
It's really not that strong in Montreal, and I'm fascinated to hear about this,
Yeah.
I'd love to, be introduced to some of these young people.
My son's on the board of 3G DC. I'd be glad to put you in touch with anybody.
That would be great. That'd be great.
Yeah.
It sounds, amazing that they even care. I have a grandson who's my youngest grandson, and he's fascinated by all this. He likes to talk. His parents are therapists. He likes to talk and he likes to ask questions, but it's unusual. It's really unusual. I'm thinking back to the epigenetic thing, and we are led to believe that each generation of people carries some knowledge with it from the previous generation. We believe that today.
I hope
that
so.
there are certain things that don't have to be learned because they've been learned, and it's easier for the people being born to acquire this knowledge because it had been part of the knowledge of their parents. And so how could we say that the trauma doesn't come along also? I mean, if I'm using that as an example.
Yeah, I think there are these mechanisms. I don't think we quite understand how that happens, but
Right.
I wonder, every Seder, I always, with my nieces and my cousins, I always read the Aufkommen, for the Warsaw Ghetto, because the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising happened during Passover. So they grew up always hearing that at Passover. So there's no way they don't know about it, because at least it's part of that. And I also bring it up on Yom Kippur. So that's the way to continue it if you keep it part of the Jewish rituals. I don't know if you all, do you do that or not?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And we read parts of my father's memoir during the time, when we say the Kaddish for the 6 million and stand to sing Eli Eli, for Eliyahu and all that. And each grandchild child as they become bar mitzvah gets to read a portion, right? Irene Munster says, did they talk or experience a difference in behavior or adaptation to the country between the survivors who were born in Germany, Austria versus Poland versus the Ukraine versus, was there any difference that you've heard in the second generation's experiences given where their parents were from?
Not really. If anything, I think that they had the ones born in Europe had a very strong identification, Jewish identity, very strong, maybe even stronger than the ones here. I mean, they had to hold on to this, and in an environment that was unfriendly to them because they were born just after the war. They were still, there was hostility towards them still. And they had to keep it secret very often. So they very strong Jewish identity.
And Zosia talks about how they felt about the Germans. I mean, this woman lived in Germany till she was 23. And she said they all hung out together, all the children of survivors. But she says, when we went to school, we were among the Germans. And their parents, it seemed like a lot of them, did not let the Germans come into their house. And she tells a story about once she invited a German friend into her house and her mother walked in. She thought she was at work or something, and within 5 minutes, they got rid of her. They got her out of there. So even in Germany.
But as far as there being a difference between them, we weren't with them long enough to be able to detect something like that.
There's also some more comments about how important the museum and Yad Vashem has been to children and to the different generations. It gave them a much deeper understanding and a picture of what their Zayda went through. My son paired with a victim of the Holocaust for his bar mitzvah. I have a video footage of my father's story, and so on. I just wanted to mention that the generations after here in DC, we have a program called Remember a Child, which helps to pair a child murdered before the bar mitzvah in Europe with a child going through bar mitzvah here. So if anyone's interested in that program, we run that program.
Another thing that's been very helpful are the survivors that go into the schools who speak. That, I don't know, do you have that there too? I'm sure, yeah. And that has been incredible, especially like in the schools where there weren't only Jewish kids, in the schools that were mixed. And
actually, most of the people now coming into the Montreal Holocaust Museum come from French schools.
Yeah.
French.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was wondering also whether you have a Holocaust education as part of your school system in DC.
in Maryland, it is not required. It's not mandatory, but it does exist. Yes, there is a
But
whole.
it's
In
not
Montgomery County, it is in every school.
It
Every
is in
middle
every
school
school,
and high school.
really.
despite the fact that it's not mandated. And we just had a new bill passed called the Never Again bill, which gave another huge amount of money to the Holocaust Museum for the purpose of, over the next 10 years, of sending out more and more education to the school systems. So
May I add something? My mother used to go to the Montgomery County schools and speak about her experiences along with some of her friends. And I've taken her to different places, even in Virginia, and I was amazed with the reception and the stories that she told the children. You could hear a pin drop.
Yeah.
They were so interested and they loved her. It was amazing. It was amazing for me to watch my mother stand up unscripted and just speak so eloquently. So I have wonderful memories. My mom is still alive. She's 95.
Wow.
And she struggles, but she's still here, and her baby sister is 91. And it's
That's great.
interesting. I have wonderful stories if anybody wants to hear them sometimes, but I'm sorry I didn't tune in earlier, and I'll give you back your platform. Thank you.
And they still do that in Montgomery County. Survivors still go to the middle schools and high schools.
Because in Montreal, it's not required education. So, and we're working on it, that's for sure.
But you should get what you should do is these testimonies you have, get to the Holocaust Museum, all Holocaust museums, and put them in, but try to get excerpts of it in the museum in the school system in Montreal. That's exactly your answer.
Well, we did, that we were in touch with the schools. I mean, yeah, we try.
Yeah.
It's just really not easy. We had, for many years, Jews were part of the Protestant school system, and there was a dual school system where you were either Catholic or Protestant, and Jews fell into the Protestants. Now it's not anymore dual, but it's still the same. Nothing really has changed. They've just taken away the words that are, Catholic and Protestant.
It's very funny because there were survivors after the war that came with their children to Montreal. They came from France and Belgium. And so the parents wanted to put them into a French school. They took them to the French school. They went into the French school and they were told, you can't go to a French school because you're Jewish, you're not Catholic. So they had to go, they all ended up going to English schools.
It's a very Catholic province, no matter what. It's a very Catholic province, any way you look at it.
Yeah.
Even though it isn't anymore.
So several people have mentioned that in the tri-state area here, Maryland, Virginia, and DC, there is Holocaust education in all the schools, and the survivors do come in and speak.
Oh.
Someone had a good, an important question, which we're struggling with. The question is, how do we as 2Gs rise to fill the very big shoes of our parents? We obviously don't have the firsthand experience that can be provided by the survivors. Will our testimony have the same effect?
It's an interesting question.
Would anybody in the audience like to answer that or comment on that question?
That's a hard one.
So I will say that not from the 2G perspective, but this very active 3G DC group, they took a course, an 8-week course last summer
Right.
in how to preserve the memories of their grandparents and how to teach it. And I think there were 6 of them that took this 8-week course on their own time and their own dime. And they were just about to embark on going into local schools in the tri-state area when COVID hit. So they haven't done it yet, but they're ready.
Hi, I'm Ellen back in Greenberg, and both my parents were survivors and passed away. My parents were in the classrooms for decades telling their stories. And I have bags and bags of every single letter every student ever wrote them. I've been telling my father's story, passed away in 2008, for the past maybe 4 years. I tell it with the lesson that my father gave to me about your attitude on life and positive and how important life is. When it comes to talking about the Holocaust part, I I include his testimonial tapes because he describes in holds nothing back the details of life in Auschwitz, and is very powerful for the students to see the survivor on tape with me. What I wanted to say is, before this COVID started, I was starting a workshop for other 2Gs to find a way to make a powerful speech, and things got put on hold. So if anybody wants to contact me, I will let you know about the workshops. Feel free also. I'm part of 2G Greater New York, which I founded along with Eva Fogelman, who many of you might know, and Helen Epstein will help with the workshops. And so we're on hold right now, but I have a lot planned, and I think that there's a great opportunity for 2Gs to go out there. The survivors didn't need to be trained in how to tell their stories. It was their story. But when the 2Gs tell their stories, we need to have it prepared. It has to have a message, and our voices should be heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Thank you. We're starting to do that as well in Washington, D.C. So it'll be good to work together on that.
Absolutely.
Anyone else have a comment about the role of the 2Gs in telling our parents' stories, and perhaps the message, the impact on us as well?
Yeah, okay, you're,
I have a question.
I know that,
okay.
Sorry.
I know that for about 13 years, I was co-teaching a course at Goucher
You've got to
College up here in Baltimore.
adjust your screen. We can only see part of your face.
Oh,
okay.
I'm sorry.
That's better.
I was co-teaching a course at Goucher on oral histories of the Holocaust, and it didn't take people to have to be 2Gs. It was listening to the stories. We had students interviewing survivors, but people have done it with videos, and working with a professional storyteller up here, Jennifer Zunikoff. They were able to turn them into presentations that really spoke to the feeling and meaning that the survivors imparted to them. We had about 40 survivors whose stories were told by about 3 or 4 students each. And they continue to be told, even though the classes ended about 7 years ago. They continue to tell their stories. A presentation was made at the New Cage conference just last week by one of our students.
Wow, that's great. Do you have anything in writing about that, Steve, that you could pass on to us?
Not really. Jennifer Zunikoff would probably have the most information. I was just kind of, I helped students learn how to interview.
But she might have something written up. Okay.
Yeah, I can get you her information.
Okay. We are, I think, going to wrap up soon. So are there any other comments that people want to make?
I just had a question for the person who talked about the 3Gs who took the course. I would love to get their contact information, and I would like to give it to the Holocaust Center in Montreal. Perhaps during COVID, they might be willing to do something with 3Gs here online.
I sent a private message to Max with my contact information.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
It was the 3G New York group that trained the group in Washington.
Wonderful.
Well, I think the time has come. Sorry to say, because this has been totally fascinating. I want to thank Max and Deena, and thank Aviva very, very much for all your help and all your work, and for the films you're doing, for the films you're going to be doing, for helping to shine a light on this very, very important topic that's so dear to all of us that are on this call tonight. I also want to mention that we are planning, I hope, to have a virtual garden party, the GenAfter. We have one every year in a real garden, and that's coming up August 23rd. So if you want to stay on our mailing list, please let us know. And part of what we're going to hear are stories of various people on the 23rd, and one I don't know if everyone knows the story of former Congressman Sam Jensen, who was born in a DP camp, and then he and his family came to America, and he grew up on a Baron de Hirsch sponsored farm in Connecticut. There were these farms that Jewish refugees lived on in Connecticut, and then this particular man became an American congressman. So it'll be a fascinating story. Thank you so much. And Deena and Max, it's possible to to view the film until tomorrow. Is that what you told us, till the end of the month, or?
We'll extend it. You can. I'll keep it going there.
We can keep it going. So if you want to pass on the link to the film to other people, please do so. And other people would, then be able to benefit from this wonderful effort. Thank you, everybody. And at the end of Tisha B'Av, I think this was a very appropriate discussion for us to be having. We mourn, but then we rise, and the second generation, is here, and we have risen. So thank you again, everybody. Laila Tov, good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.